knowing it's wrong, then you'll be, it's a misdemeanor. That's what the law says, and then you could go to jail or you could be fined, or both. Now, those pieces of two provisions are being used as weapons to harass journalists. Recently, we are following Noah Dame's case in Radio Adan. The journalist made a post on social media bemoaning how residents in Adan, their rights are being trampled upon by the activities of a private business, Electrochem Ghana Limited, and its owner, Magdan. And then that matter escalated to become a matter of he sharing false information, false publication charges, and a criminal case when ideally it should have been, a civil case of defamation. The journalist has been detained. He was sentenced to be remanded for 2 weeks. He spent a week in there, has been released, but the case is ongoing. But before that, there was the Accra FM journalist Bobi Ansa, who made a claim about the First Lady using public state land for his private purposes. He was in the studio when armed security officers went in to grab him, and they were charging him by those same provisions. Even beyond the journalist, there was the executive director of ASEPA also making some pronouncements that the president is using the Ghana's private jet.
But shouldn't making such claims be substantiated so that when called into question, the person is able to say that based on this information that was available to me, I made that call, that what I said was the truth. So merely arresting the person or picking the person up does not end the case. Someone still has to put up a defense. Does that not happen? In
fact, we are not even going into whether the person, what he said is right or wrong, or substantiating it. We are saying that the way and manner we are practicalizing the law. If I have said something against the wife of the president, who is the First Lady, it is supposed to be a defamation matter, a civil matter. Why must the state be seen acting on behalf of a private individual? When I spoke about that private individual, why must armed security officers storm the studio when a journalist is doing the work? I mean, the sheer act of that, imposes that fear that the next time a journalist has something substantive to say, he will be fearing for his life that this may come after me. And this is what I mean by legislation being used against journalists.
Right. Dr. Abnai Nimwa Yeboah Benin, HOD Department of Communications at the University of Ghana. Good morning, Doc. Thank you for joining us on our Zoom platform.
Good morning, and good morning to all viewers.
Pleasure to have you join us. Now, Kwaku Korbie Asante has made certain claims about the deterioration of our rankings in international press freedom indexes. He's talking about legislation being used as tools to stifle press freedoms. He's made some examples to us. I've heard calls that some sections of the Electronic Communications Act, for example, and the Criminal Code, like he alluded, should be repealed or reviewed and taken out. Are those thoughts that you share, or do you think something else should be done to make our media space even better?
Thank you. And Kwaku is very right in the comments that he's made so far. And in fact, if I recall, I think last week, MFWA and some other civil society organizations held a press conference to call attention to the ways in which it would appear these laws are being abused in pursuit of journalists who are doing some sort of accountability journalism. So I share voice with them in saying that we have laws for a purpose, and to the extent that it would appear these laws are being applied differently from what we think is the expectation, then there is a problem. Ultimately, though, what these things, and Kwaku just ended on that note, what these things create is a sense of insecurity, a sense of lack of safety among journalists. And if you refer to the report we launched just last week, State of the Ghanaian Media Report, the chapter on the safety of journalists actually details how these activities are beginning to find meaning in the perceptions held among media employees, particularly journalists. So we find from that chapter, or that study, that generally journalists feel a sense of insecurity, a sense that in doing my work and doing it correctly, I am likely to become the subject of attack, and especially so when my work involves some form of critical journalism, accountability journalism, investigative journalism, then I am likely to be a subject of interest to those who have power and are open to abusing that power to stop me from doing my work. To that extent, then, it is a challenge for all persons within the media, but also stakeholders broadly, who have an interest in the media and the well-being of the media and its implications for our democracy. It is of concern to us these increasing cases of what would appear on the books to be civil cases, but which then tend to be treated as though they're criminal. They are a matter between the state and that journalist. And this is not in any way to say that people should feel free to go out there and publish false information or attack public officers, duty bearers, just for the sake of it. Not at all. Journalism is a profession that has its own ethics and standards. And to the extent that the person is practicing as a professional journalist, there are expectations of their role. So anybody picks up lies and publishes it, we even stakeholders would have a problem with that. But you see, the remedies, as the lawyers would educate us on, the remedies in those instances are for the person who has been slighted to take it up and go to court and say, my image has been slighted by this publication, which I can show is false. And therefore, this person ought to be charged for doing that damage to my image. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the trend that recent history is recording. It seems more to be instances where, because of how close perhaps some individuals who feel slighted are to the corridors of power, then the state seems to be the machinery that takes up and fights for their cause, instead of these individuals taking up civil courses of action.
Doc, the key findings cut across a number of critical areas, one of which was media ownership and regulation, and the allegation or the idea of the concentration of a lot of the media power in few hands who happen to be linked to corridors of power, like you're saying, and that has been found to be a problem. We have an independent body that's supposed to make sure that the public does not feel shortchanged or the public interest is always held supreme. Is that happening? And if it's not, what can we do?
Well, according to the chapter on media ownership and regulation, we should have some interest in how the ownership regulation regime looks and really what happens within it. So a bit of a detail in that chapter. It finds that when it comes to the processes towards securing licenses for owning particularly broadcast media, radio, TV, etc., there seems to be things that we need to begin to pay attention to from a regulatory point of view. They may not necessarily have come into being because somebody was being dodgy or somebody was trying to cut corners and favor A person versus B person. They may not necessarily come because of some wrongdoing on the part of a person sitting on a certain regulatory committee. However, there seem to be lapses that we need to pay attention to and correct to forestall the chances of such problems happening in the future, even if these problems are not coming out of intent for wrongdoing. So, for instance, the chapter notes the fact that if you look at media regulation, ownership regulation, from a public interest point of view, the idea would be that for a developing country such as ours, we should look to using the broadcast frequency space for the public good, and therefore allocations, operation of these frequencies should not be so heavily driven by commercial interests and commercial forces, nor should they be driven by other interests than public interest. So, for instance, if besides commercial interests, we notice that political interest is making inroads, tribal interests making inroads, religious interests making inroads, and inroads here meaning too many of these frequencies are in the hands of people who are broadcasting with that kind of logic, then our fear is that the ultimate public good, public interest, may be being sacrificed in pursuit of any of these other interests that are signaled. And the report shows that if you look at the radio, particularly space, it would appear that there's a lot of commercial interest within that space. It's a business sphere. People see it as a place where they can make money, and so they are interested. And there's the trend towards conglomeration. So you acquire this platform, tomorrow you acquire another, and one person will be holding, let's say, 15 licenses to run different media, most of which is driven by commercial interest. That can have concerns, because what it means is that perhaps some of the news, some of the content that should promote cohesiveness, some of the content that should promote a development, ownership and buy-in logic may be put aside in the interest of, for instance, content that just easily brings eyes and ears to you, sensationalized content, falsehood, etc., just so that people will come to the platform and you can sell them to advertisers. So there is some concern over there from a regulatory point of view. There is also the finding that there seems to be a bit of a political capture also going on. And if you notice, even in popular media conversations, we know that quite a lot of the platforms are in the hands of politicians. This is not an Accra thing. Perhaps it's even much more so as you go into the regions. People who are politically exposed, people who have some political interest, those platforms.
Right.
To push their political agenda. Again, in that equation, what is the public good may be sacrificed in favor of whatever it takes so that that person is looking good to the electorate and therefore is eligible for election. So we have, the chapter notes some of these concerns for the attention of regulators so that whatever rubric is now being used to decide whether or not to assign a frequency to somebody perhaps needs a relook, so that we think about how do we plug the kinds of holes that have resulted in too many stations in the hands of commercial versus political, too many stations concentrated in Accra, Kumasi, to the neglect of other communities that perhaps could have been served by community media, etc. So the findings in that chapter, we believe, are, if you like, a diagnostic tool that regulators can then go back to the drawing board using these findings to say, the system we have now, what are the gaps that have led to this evidence the report is suggesting, and what needs doing to correct for them?
Both of the items on these key findings on the safety of the journalists and the media regulation that we've talked about places the burden of responsibility with the third party. There is a part which is the professional practice, which lays the burden solely at the doors of the journalist. Training of journalists is important here. How journalists are employed, the whom you know process versus the, you deserve it process. How are journalists paid is also something that the report mentioned. All these feed into the broader conversations of what is the relationship between the media and national development, and how can we use the media properly so that they are not unduly influenced against the public interest to seek commercial, political, religious, tribal, and other interests. What are we saying to ourselves when we say, physician, heal yourself?
Well, this... when it comes to us, I think that it's spread across. We need to first look at the role of the journalist himself. We look at the media owner himself, and perhaps the associations and the regulatory bodies. I mean, you have in just a while summed up almost all the key findings when it comes to the working conditions, professional practice, media and media and its contribution to national development. I think to some extent, for instance, if you want to talk about the working conditions of a journalist, you mentioned how some of them don't have working contracts, how some of them their working conditions, no healthcare, no counseling process for them, no scheme for no established scheme for promotion. It's about whom you know, and all that. These are conditions that we can perhaps begin to lay at the feet of the media owners, and maybe bring in the associations to say, as a body, can we come together and have some joint advocacy, inviting these media owners into the fray to have a conversation on such matters. I think, for instance, we need to have a policy framework that should guide, how, as a media house, how do you receive gifts, and how does that reflect the conversation on Solly? You get it, so that it's genuine that at the end of the year somebody would want to bring a hamper to the office, but to what extent, what is their limit, so that it doesn't begin to look like it is beginning to influence your work as a media house and how you can hold into account such people. Also, the issues even about safety of journalists. Whilst we may be holding the government to an account, that we need to see that the perpetrators are being punished. We need to see that there's some redress, action happening, so that we can cut what we call impunity. We have to come back to ourselves and say, before the journalist goes out, as the editor, what have you put in place that this journalist is going into a space where it's heated, it's a demonstration, election period, some aggrieved political party agents are out there, taking an action. What steps have you taken? What protective, gear, what something that you've given to them? What training, what capacity have you given to them? And then again, even talking about the capacity issues. There's a practice where, and indeed, our field is also a field of talent, right? You can go to school, be trained on how to do a story and write and all those things, but being able to present, speak, sometimes to comes with people having that innate ability. And so, especially among the local language, people pick people from different places who may not have that practical or professional training into journalism. I'm talking about the capacity building issues. To what extent do you take a person through, journalism practice? What measures do you put in place so that this person, before coming on air, understands what the ethics are, the code of contact, the codes are, and how we are going to work through them? The report shows that journalists are very much conscious of the code of ethics, but we see at some point wanton disabuse of the professional standards and ethics, one-sided stories, people getting, being influenced, people doing things just for the sensationalism aspect and all that. So on our own, we need to look at all those issues, build capacity, provide good working conditions inside, ensure that your own security and safety of your journalists should be in your hands before maybe you want to look at the government and all those things that needs to be addressed.
Kweku, thank you for spending time with us. Dr. Abena Inimwa Yeboah Banin, if you're still there, would you like to make your final comment? And where it comes to viability of the media itself, we want to project ourselves as this beacon of democracy and as these custodians of freedoms, especially of expression. Are we there, and what better could we do? Your final word on this.
As custodians of free expression and democracy, if we wanted to look at our viability and the chances that we will be here doing it in any meaningful way, maybe when next the Department of Communication Studies is celebrating another 50th, which would mean we're 100 years old. Would the media be there to support Ghana's democracy, and would we be doing it in a manner that is viable? Our report suggests that we need to pay attention if we want to make sure that our media will be doing its job and doing good at it in perhaps the next 50 years.
Right.
And the reasons are plentyfold, if you like. So, for instance, we notice in that chapter that the digital evolutions are directly and sometimes negatively impacting financial inflows into the media. A lot of advertising revenue is running onto digital platforms, to the Twitters and co. And so it's placing pressure on local media, how they mobilize resources to be able to run their activities, including to resource and pay their employees well, is a concern. And we also notice that the state of the Ghanaian economy itself is not helping matters. If your media are operating in this country, there are all sorts of very high operational utility costs you must incur. Your equipment are mostly being imported. You know what the dollar is doing to such activity, etc. So it's a number of factors that together work to ensure that a lot of media organizations in this country, if we wanted to be honest about it, are only breaking even. That is when they're doing very well.
Right, Dr. Abena. I think that we need another opportunity to get into more details of the state of the Ghanaian media, and I'm sure that we will create another chance to have you perhaps in studio so we can have a lot more of these conversations. Thank you so much for your time with us this morning. Dr. Abena Inimwa Yeboah-Benin is the HOD Department of Communication Studies at the University of Ghana. She was on our Zoom platform. At the table, Mr. Kweku Krobi Asante, Communications Lead at the Media Foundation for West Africa. Thank you so much for making the time. We've been talking about the media. We'll have that conversation again, I'm sure. For now, Valerie will be getting ready to give us some breakfast from the art side of the table. We are sending birthday shouts right now, and it's going to Mr. Lawson Che Menu, CEO of Lawson DeRay Man Bitters and Lawson Herbal Mixture. GBC wishes you a pleasant birthday, and we wish you pleasant years ahead. We hope that you are successful and have many happy moments, as they are uncountable. We hope that they are as uncountable as the sands on the seashore. We also have massive birthday shouts to Madame Barbara Gazy and also Shirley Annan of the TV Newsroom. My little girl's birthday is also today. You know yourself, we call you Mimi because we love you. Happy birthday to all of you who are celebrating.